By Any Other Name, by Used Muse. Chapter 1. What Dreams May Come. Varian allowed himself a smile. The contents of a small copper pot sitting in front of him had finally begun to shimmer and shift from a murky brown to a midnight blue. He'd created something new. He'd been at this experiment for a few days straight, losing count of the hours as he deconstructed the miasma. The vial containing a hint of colorful liquid happened to wash up at the lake's edge during one of his scouting trips. The tiny waterfront was nearby enough to his father's house that he could frequent its beach, hunting for oddities and ingredients necessary for his work. Normally, that meant bits of sediment or rock formations that could be crushed or melted to obtain some useful metals. He never expected to come across something like this. The purple mixture was certainly some kind of ancient alchemy, most likely taken from an almanac or medicinal handbook. The ingredients were relatively simple, but the results... Varian shivered with excitement, remembering the potent effect. The once strict grocer becoming a simpering pushover with only a few dashes in his morning coffee. Varian had begun to assemble more ingredients, with essentially no resistance, enabling him to not only recreate, but experiment. The truth serum had been the first to come out of his obsessive investigation. He'd spent several days fiddling with slight variations, looking for changes of color or luminosity, indications that a different effect was being cultivated. At first, when the liquid brewed green, he'd been hopeful that his changes to the formula had pushed the personality inversion even further, creating an elixir that would render the victim's entire personality mute. That would make retrieving the last of the sundrop flower an easy task if it was, as he hoped, buried somewhere deep in the castle's dark, endless basement. However, after testing the green liquid, first on himself and then on some unsuspecting neighbors, the truth serum's power was revealed. Not bad at all, as a first step towards retrieval. Varian took a pipette's worth of the dark blue liquid and squirted it into 2 awaiting glasses of water. But it wasn't enough to know the sundrop flower still sat withered and dying somewhere, even if he traveled with Rapunzel to retrieve it. He grimaced at the thought of the princess. He couldn't let his father sit in his amber prison for one more day. He needed that flower. And with Cassie and Eugene around, he sighed grimly, I'll never get her alone. Coronan guards were disposed of easily enough, but he knew Rapunzel's 2 constant friends were more proactive than the rest of the palace. Left alone, they'd get in the way. He mixed the blue into the clear water until the last trace of color disappeared. He swirled the cups cavalierly, contemplating his next move. He was sorry to hurt them, especially Cassandra. Focus. Cassie would be fine, eventually, and besides, his eyes darkened. She'd stood by, watching as he was dragged away by those palace guards. He placed the cups back on his workbench, his mind made up. A small smile crept across his face as he called out, Rudiger, come down here, buddy. He waved encouragingly as his small furry friend crawled gingerly towards him from across the room. Don't worry, he added, noting the raccoon's reluctant gait. Nothing scary this time. You won't have to do anything but wait. He knelt down and picked up Rudiger, setting him on the workbench next to the glass cups. Giving them one more stir, he glanced down towards the large amber structure that dominated his workroom. I won't let you down, Dad. Cassandra tore towards Rapunzel's room. She hadn't slept last night, marking 1 happy month of insomnia. Few things could worsen her mood after 31 sleepless nights, but given her luck, she was unsurprised when Eugene Fitzherbert rushed her by the staircase door, prattling off inane questions and sticking his nose where it didn't belong. Lucky for you, it doesn't matter what you wear tonight, because you aren't invited, Fitzherbert, she said coolly, tearing her menu out of his hands. This is a private event, ergo no former thieves allowed. Since when am I not included in private events? Eugene shot back, eyeing her warily. Got up on the wrong side of the Iron Maiden this morning? Shove it, Eugene, I've got a long day. She was already halfway down the length of the hall. Eugene sighed and ran after her, struggling to stay at pace. Fair, fair. But I don't see how you're invited, and I'm not. Ladies-in-waiting outrank future kings now? Cass's face folded into a withering glare. Ladies-in-waiting who are on duty have to be where Crowley asks us to be, and you aren't anyone's king. Maybe technically. Eugene tried to slow her down, but Cass was relentless. Look, is Freddie still mad about the incident with the griffin? 'Cause we both know I'm not the only one who should be taking the fall for that little Eugene. Cass finally stopped in front of Rapunzel's door. Yes, these are the king's orders. I'm just carrying them out. He's trying to cut down on liabilities, and with the delicate nature of the guest's visitation... Delicate, huh? Eugene stared her down. It was certainly possible King Frederick had shut him out. On the other hand, this wouldn't be the first time Cass fibbed her way into getting what she wanted. What could the old Coronans be pissy about this time? Gosh, I don't know. Could it be the huge black rocks tearing up their countryside? Cass preferred Eugene completely in the dark when she could help it, but sometimes it was worth to see his eyes go wide with curiosity. Reminded him whose castle this really was. So if you could please keep whatever egotistical rampage you're on today in check, and save your date for another night. Egotistical, he sputtered. I'll have you know. Rapunzel flung the door open and bellowed a friendly good morning at her two companions. She wrapped her arms around Eugene, planting a kiss on his cheek. Cass quietly snuck around, grabbing a brush and Rapunzel's many hair ties. Another day of working, completely exhausted. After a month of dealing with lack of sleep, Cassandra thought she had adjusted, but Eugene's presence during her mornings with Rapunzel made her want to collapse. It wasn't just that she didn't personally care for Eugene. Yes, of course, a former thief and enemy of the kingdom lucking their way into the easy life irked her. It was antithetical to how she saw her own story unfolding, working as hard as she possibly could here at the castle until her true destiny revealed itself. Eugene, on the other hand, had gone from enemy to beloved hero in one afternoon. After being forced to spend time with him, the princess's happiness had been enough to cool her feelings from outright animosity to mild annoyance. But recently, as she helped Rapunzel get ready, Cass's mind flashed to the confrontation between herself and Eugene just last month. It had started with her first sleepless night, when the nightmares began. Before the princess had returned, Cass's dreams wandered to the faraway lands to which she wanted to travel, the fights she would win, and the life she was meant to live. She felt utterly detached from her grunt work around the castle, taking every opportunity to sneak off for extra training or an early morning ride with Fidela. These days, however, taking care of the princess seemed to be all her unconscious mind could conjure. Rapunzel flooded her dreams. Which wasn't so bad, all things considered. Despite everything, Cass had to admit her view of the lost princess had softened over the months. She did have a horrible tendency to pry and overstep, considering herself with the ins and outs of Cassandra's personal life. She often ignored Cass's sound advice, throwing herself into unnecessary danger, more often than not dragging her handmaiden along too. She was so unlike anyone Cass had ever met, and that was frustrating. That night, Cass had been unable to rescue her from a foreign invasion. She tore through a castle in flames, screaming her name, praying she wasn't too late. She couldn't lose her, not like this. A faint voice called out to her, and then she woke up, a thin layer of sweat coating her skin. Her breath was choppy and her cheeks flushed. Get out of my head, Raps. Royals are royals, no matter how many years they spend in a tower. Of course she was fond of the princess, but Cass was still a lady-in-waiting, a servant. She tore down to the stables, an early morning ride to the Coronan shore with Fidela calling out to her numb mind, promising distraction and a clear head by sunrise. Except that instead of a quiet, empty stable awaiting her, she heard a theatrical voice practicing turns of phrase in the darkness. She drew her dagger and crept towards the entrance, stealthily sneaking in to uncover Fitzherbert, on one knee, with that damn ring again. Eugene, she sheathed her weapon as the thief spun on his heels. Cassandra, he spat out, turning her long, elegant ah into a flat eh, a quirk he'd been quick to pick up when he found out it bothered her. What are you doing here? I was planning on taking an early morning ride with Fidela, she fired back, attempting to push down the knot forming in her stomach. Not that I need to ask what you're doing here, Mr. Prince Consort. The former thief rolled his eyes, pocketing the ring. And what would you know about it, Ice Queen? He said dismissively, strolling past Cassandra. It's only been 4 months since the last one. You might want to slow your roll. You're coming off a little desperate. She tried to keep her banter light, but the bitter edge got caught up in her throat. Eugene turned back to her, stung. I get it. My first proposal went less than ideally, but the next one is going to be a success. Rapunzel's already basically said yes. He smiled as the remaining color drained from Cassandra's face. So what if Rapunzel didn't know about his second proposal? She knew that he knew they were meant to end up together. It was just a matter of figuring out the right moment. And despite the scowl currently occupying her face, he was confident Cass knew that too. Somewhere deep, deep down. So why does it bother her so much? Cass's eyes darkened, her lack of sleep impeding her read on Eugene's bluff. Could Rapunzel really have already said yes? The exhaustion and her strange dreams burned in her mind, relieving her of her better judgment. Listen, Fitzherbert. You might have everyone in Corona under your spell. The king and queen seem truly convinced that all you want is Rapunzel's happiness. But I know a bloodsucker when I see one, and I won't allow my home to be overtaken by a con artist trying to play the most gullible girl in the kingdom. Cass spat her words out in a hushed whisper, looking up to see Eugene's face contort in genuine hurt. She felt guilt wash over her, buckling her confident stance into insecurity. She reached an arm out. Eugene, is that what you think of me? He took a step back. You really think this is some get-rich-quick scheme? The thief laughed softly to himself. And here I thought we were starting to get to know each other, Cass. He stole quickly towards the door, stepping into the early spring air. He shot her a glance and shrugged. Well, at least I know you always have Rapunzel's best interests at heart. The door was empty before Cass could say another word. She cursed, sliding down into the hay and running her hands through her coarse hair. Why did I say that? Feeling pathetic, she took out her knife and began attacking the ground in front of her. Bad practice if she wanted to maintain the blade's durability, but at the moment, it felt good to stab something. I know that Eugene isn't going anywhere. God, she obviously loves him. Her mind drifted to her dreams from last night. She leaned her head to the wall and closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion overwhelm her. All she did was take care of the princess, and now she couldn't even take evenings off. Since when do I care about royals and who they marry? It's her life. She can do what she wants. Cassandra stood and turned back towards the castle. She had to be up in an hour. Another full day of work. Castle life waited for nobody, least of all a handmaiden. Eugene isn't invited? Rapunzel's blonde hair whipped around. She looked pointedly at Cassandra, mouth open in disbelief. Cass rolled her eyes. It's on your father's orders. I'm sorry, Raps, but they're trying to avoid any further mishaps. She futzed around Rapunzel's room, finalizing their preparation for the day. Eugene looked on from the doorframe, smiling as his girlfriend fought for his place. Cass wanted to smack that smirk right off his face. In the months since they'd fought at the stables, they hadn't said another word about it. Or to Rapunzel. But that wasn't his fault! The princess squared herself in front of Cassandra, hands on her hips. Besides, both the Griffin and my father left happy, so maybe we should provide a little personality reversal. Look, Rapunzel, the whole situation seems a little fraught to me, she said dismissively, going around the princess and pulling out her only remaining clean dress. The other outfits had been rendered unwearable by yesterday's painting activity. If you want to take it up with your father, be my guest, but maybe Fitzherbert can sit this one out without making a huge stink about it. She caught his eye from across the room. Checking to make sure Rapunzel wasn't looking, she stuck out her tongue. The princess sighed and stepped behind her folding screen and into the dress Cassandra had waiting. Well, maybe you're right. One dinner isn't such a big deal. As Eugene began to sputter his disapproval, she rolled her eyes and shouted, Besides, I'm sure it won't take too long, and we can still make it a late evening date instead. The blonde hair popped up from behind the thin veneer. Wouldn't that be more romantic anyway? She batted her hard eyes at the rogue, who couldn't help but let the frown melt off his face. Well, it'll definitely shake up my big plans for tonight, but I guess you're right. It'll probably be a snooze fest anyway. He smiled wide as Rapunzel re-entered the room. It quickly dissipated as Cassandra followed close behind, satisfied at his retreat. His eyes narrowed, and unable to resist the barb, shot back, I suppose your lady-in-waiting will still be present tonight, despite her involvement with the Griffin incident? Cass frowned. Well, she is officially on duty, Rapunzel smiled up at him. But, Eugene, if it means so much to you, I'll ask my father again if you can join us. I'm having lunch with him today. The princess gave him a quick peck on the lips before starting out of the room, Cassandra's blue dress following close behind. As they cleared the door, Cass's head whipped around and gave him one last withering gaze before turning the corner. He listened as Cass began a monotone delivery of what sounded like a packed schedule, her voice fading as they sped towards their first engagement. Eugene sighed, running his hands through his hair. He understood he couldn't be at every royal event, and the king and queen still had some reason to be distrustful of him. Trouble seemed to follow the trio everywhere. Not that it was ever entirely his fault. He knew they were probably just being cautious, and Cass's behavior was only out of love for Rapunzel. But if it was true, and that if things went according to his and Rapunzel's plan, he would be prince consort someday, why would his future queen want to be best friends with someone who had it out for him? Are you feeling okay? Rapunzel cut Cassandra off at the end of her prep for the breakfast they were attending. Nobles from the Hoskins house, blah blah blah, old Corona, something something, crop failures. The young princess was more curious about her best friend. She could always tell when something was bothering her, even when Cassandra didn't want her to ask. What do you mean? Cass kept her eyes forward, unyielding. Rapunzel sighed and tugged at her arm. I know my father doesn't want too many people at this dinner, but you were being more snippy than usual with Eugene this morning. Cass remained aloof. What is up with you two recently? You know I hate it when my two favorite people refuse to get along. It's nothing, Raps, really. I just haven't been sleeping lately, and your boyfriend tends to step on my every nerve. Cassandra tried to resume at pace, but Rapunzel was already in front of her. Cass sighed and looked away, not allowing Rapunzel's curiosity to get the better of her. Caught up in the monotony of shepherding her around Corona, she could ignore the painful feelings brought on by the strange dreams. But when the princess poked her nose into it... Are you sure, Cass? You look a little... red, she said cautiously. Did I do something to make you mad? She took Cassandra's roughened hands in her own. The handmaiden felt her cheeks blush. I'm fine, I promise. Cass pulled her hands away and turned Rapunzel around. Come on, we'll be late to meet with the Hoskins if we don't keep walking. Rapunzel quieted to Cass's relief, although she continued to cast worried glances towards her friend every few seconds. Cass kept her eyes on their destination. The dreams had only intensified in the months since. Cass hardly even tried to sleep anymore. Some nights, she woke up in that cold sweat, terrified Rapunzel had been stolen away. Other nights, she woke to a red face. Thoughts of the two of them smiling and laughing in her bedroom still fresh in her mind. Cass had begun to prefer the nightmares. At least those were less confusing. Cass had always thought caring too much for other people was, at best, an unnecessary distraction. Something for people who had nothing else to fill up their empty lives. At worst, it was a liability. She focused on other more practical things, like her training, fighting, protecting and preserving in a dangerous world. She cared for her father, of course, but that was out of respect for the man who'd adopted her, saved her from a life on the Coronan streets. After she turned 16, he'd started floating the idea of marriage, bringing young tradesmen home for dinner every few weeks. Cass chuckled, remembering the long, awkward silences. But after a year or so and a few major fights, the proposals stopped. Now at 22, Cass was thankfully pretty much certain her father had given up. Growing up in the castle, she saw young women being used by bargaining chips, gifts to and from powerful families. True love could be afforded to long-lost princesses and no one else. Just another reason not to think about it. Getting out of marriage had been easy as an orphan with nothing to offer, made even easier by her not wanting anyone. Her eyes flashed sideways. During her recent off-duty time alone with Rapunzel, swimming in their lagoon or sneaking around just the two of them, a question had wormed its way into her head. She dismissed it as ridiculous. She simply cared deeply about the princess. Given that she wasn't used to feeling that way about anyone, the feelings had intensified and confused her. And yet... During her recent off-duty alone time with Rapunzel, swimming in their lagoon or sneaking around just the two of them, a question had wormed its way into her head. She dismissed it as ridiculous. She simply cared deeply about the princess. Given that she wasn't used to feeling that way about anyone, the feelings had intensified and confused her. And yet... They arrived at the local eatery without any more conversation. Rapunzel spotted the local lord and sat him down near the window, beginning their breakfast with gusto. Cass looked on, proud of how her diplomacy skills had grown in the months since she arrived. She was something to watch in action now, all smiles and boundless energy. Suddenly embarrassed, Cass quietly joined Rapunzel at the table. She couldn't get so lost in her thoughts. Someone could notice her staring aimlessly at her friend, her future queen, she reminded herself.